Olá, eu sou Haroldo Cerávulo Cereza, diretor editorial de Opera Mundi, e esta é uma edição especial do programa 20 Minutos. Este programa não é conduzido nem por mim, nem pelo Breno Altman, mas sim por Glenn Greenwald, que recebeu no programa System Update o acadêmico Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein tem sido um dos mais ativos críticos à política de Israel para o Oriente Médio. Desde 2000, quando ele publicou A Indústria do Holocausto, seu nome provoca reações terríveis dos políticos em Tel Aviv e também dos grupos sionistas ao redor do mundo. Finkelstein tem denunciado nos Estados Unidos a política genocida de Israel muito antes do 7 de outubro, mas de lá para cá se manteve na linha de frente no combate às ações de guerra contra a população palestina. Nesta entrevista, Finkelstein trata de assuntos históricos, mas também de situações muito recentes, como a proposta de Donald Trump de tirar toda a população palestina de Gaza. Ele também trata dos ataques da administração Trump a outros países e como os Estados Unidos têm lidado com Israel. Ou seja, é uma entrevista imperdível, muito importante, que a Opera Mundi publica em português, com legendas, com exclusividade. Nossos agradecimentos aí ao Glenn pela sessão deste programa, que nós consideramos muito importante para o nosso público. Não perca, a entrevista começa logo depois da vinheta. Muito obrigado.
Professor Norman Finkelstein is a good friend of the show. He's appeared here many times. He is, without doubt, one of the most informed scholars on the history of Israel and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. He is, among other things, the author of the 2000 book, The Holocaust Industry, which described how Israelis and Zionists exploit the Holocaust as a massive industry in order to exploit the world to get huge amounts of money that end up supporting the Israeli government. He's been a vocal critic of the Israeli government long before the destruction of Gaza, but during the destruction of Gaza has really emerged as a strong and morally clear and highly informed scholar and analyst of this situation. We are always delighted to have him here. It is, he's a guest who uniformly our audience reacts to very positively as somebody who helps them navigate and understand very complex issues. We sat down with him today, a little bit ago, for about an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 20 minutes, in which we explored a wide range of issues, beginning with the ceasefire in Gaza and the Trump administration's policy toward that region, and a whole variety of other related issues as well. We're going to show you the first good chunk of this interview here on our Rumble live show, but to hear the rest of it, you can head over to our locals community to hear the rest, the last 20, 25 minutes or so. And you can just simply click the join button to become a member of our locals community, which is absolutely critical to supporting the independent journalism that we do here. Here is our discussion with Professor Finkelstein that we recorded earlier today. Norman, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. We haven't spoken since the imposition of, or the agreement to, the ceasefire that was agreed to just days before Donald Trump's inauguration on January 20th. There have been violations of that ceasefire. There's a lot of imperfections with that ceasefire. But do you think the ceasefire itself is a positive step forward when compared to what came before it?
That's a difficult question to answer because there's an immediate effect, which of course is positive. The people of Gaza were celebrating the fact that after 16 months of relentless and historically unprecedented bombing, the genocide in that form had come to an end. And it would be verging on satanic on my part to any way be critical of that development. There was huge human relief at the end, at the cessation of the bombing. As to where it will lead, I'm a little bit skeptical about the terms of the agreement, based on two facts. Number one, if you look at the historical precedents, all of the terms attached to agreements after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, after the Mavi Marmara incident on May 31st, 2010, after Operation Protective Edge in 2014, all of the terms, apart from the actual ceasefire, all of the terms to lift the medieval criminal blockade of Gaza, to ease at least the criminal medieval blockade of Gaza, those terms were never honored. And it was striking that after Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, when Israel had to decide whether to agree to a ceasefire, which also included easing the blockade or lifting the blockade, Ehud Barak, who was the defense minister at the time, he said, once the ceasefire is agreed to, all the other terms are forgotten. And it was on that assumption that Israel agreed to the ceasefire. My guess this time around, and I don't pretend to any insider knowledge on the subject, nor have I followed it closely, my guess this time is Donald Trump wants to take credit for having gotten all the hostages released, and he can claim that as a huge, quote unquote, diplomatic victory. And so he is waiting for the hostages, every last one of them, to be released. He'll become a hero in Israel, and he will, as I said, be able to claim a major diplomatic victory. But all the rest, it seems to me completely far-fetched to believe that will be followed through on. And that brings me to my second reservation. It strikes me as totally far-fetched that after spending 15, 16 months trying to render Gaza unlivable, which was the main goal after October 7th, to render it unlivable so that those who weren't killed would be faced with only two options. As the senior government advisor, Giora Eiland, put it, they'll be left with only two options: to stay and to starve, or to leave. I find it completely untenable that suddenly the Israeli government is going to do an about-face and say, all we are saying is give peace a chance. That doesn't seem to me very plausible. And with Donald Trump's announced plan of deporting the entire population, in his view, it will be a willing deportation because of new opportunities he promises to open up to them. But whether it's a willing deportation or an unwilling deportation, the fact remains deportation is incompatible with humanitarian aid to make life sustainable, and it's certainly incompatible with reconstruction a reconstruction, not the turning of Gaza into a Riviera, but a reconstruction that enables the population to stay in place. It's humanitarian aid, reconstruction are simply incompatible fundamentally, not just incompatible, in contradiction with Israel's announced goal, objective after October 7th, to render Gaza unlivable, and it's incompatible with Donald Trump's announced objective of turning Gaza into the Riviera minus its indigenous population. So I believe that once all of the Israeli hostages are returned, Israel will be given a free hand, and the prospects of sufficient humanitarian aid and reconstruction, which were the humanitarian aid was integrated into stage 1 and stage 2, and reconstruction in this nebulous stage 3, even stage 2 is nebulous. I can't see that happening.
Yeah, I take your skepticism, and not just take it, but share it completely. At the same time, I'm wondering whether, it's certainly true that the Israeli goal from the start was to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza in order to claim it for themselves. And in order to do that, as you also correctly observed, there was a need to make Gaza uninhabitable. If you listen to Trump and everyone around Trump, the premise of everything they're saying is that Gaza is already uninhabitable. Steve Witkoff, his envoy, went to Gaza on a short little excursion into it, protected by the IDF, and basically came back and said there's nothing there but rubble. Trump's whole argument for this pipe dream of cleansing Gaza is that there's nothing left of Gaza. There's no civilian infrastructure. There's basically no buildings left, all of which is true. So just focused on, for a moment, on the narrow question of whether Israel intends to resume bombing, whether Trump wants the Israelis to resume bombing. Why does Israel really need to keep bombing, given that they've essentially turned Gaza into nothing but a pile of rubble?
I totally agree with that. I would just like to add a couple of relevant observations. Number one, those who are outraged at what Trump has been saying, it ought to be borne in mind, the perfectly obvious ought to be borne in mind, that Trump is ostensibly simply reacting to a situation created by the Biden administration. If I understood from day one, and I said it from day one, that Israel's goal was to render Gaza uninhabitable, certainly the Biden administration, Mr. Blinken, they were aware of that goal. They green-lighted that goal, and they enabled that goal. So the situation to which President Trump is speaking was created under Biden's watch. If there were any doubt about what Israel's goal was, all you have to do is read the statements that were coming out of Israel at the highest, most levels to the base of Israeli society, from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, and in both official institutions and civil society institutions. There was a consensus, and here I would want to note that by now we have so many compendia of collecting all the statements, the genocidal statements that were uttered during the past 15 months. We have in May 29, 2024, South Africa submitted a letter to the Security Council, and it was accompanied by 121 pages, single-spaced, of documentation in its entirety comprising the genocidal statements by the Israeli society. And I want to emphasize that because sometimes you can say a genocidal policy is a state policy, but I do not believe that's an accurate description of what unfolded in Gaza the past 16 months. It was a national project encompassing the whole of Israeli society. And so there was simply a kind of explosion of the id, the unconscious, the subconscious, whatever departments of the psyche you are you believe in. There was this explosion of the most horrendous genocidal statements every day, every hour, on every social media option. There was this explosion. So you can't really say, that the Israelis didn't know, as the Germans pretended after Hitler's defeat. You can't say they didn't know. And you certainly can't say the Biden administration didn't know. If I knew, they knew. All you had to do was converse with Israeli officials or read your daily updates provided to senior officials by the CIA and other institutions. All you had to do was read them. As I said, there was the South African submission on May 29th to the Security Council. There's this submission, communication it's called, by Omer Schatz, who's a professor at Sciences Po in France. He produced a very substantial compendium. There's the compendium by Lee Mordechai, who is a Princeton-trained historian in Byzantium studies, but he knows how to do research. He produced a compendium. There are the ones put out by Amnesty International, a 250-page compendium. But that one didn't just include statements, it also included what was being done on the ground. So it was perfect. And there was the Human Rights Watch report, more recent report, on Israel's systematic denial of water to the people of Gaza, which Human Rights Watch classified as a crime against humanity, an act of extermination, as well, the crime against humanity of extermination, and also described it as acts of genocide. So all this was known, and it was also the idea of deporting the people from Gaza that originated with Secretary of State Blinken, who tried to exhort Egypt to accept the expulsion of the population from Gaza, knowing full well it was going to be a one-way ticket. So at some level, one has to say, not in any way to diminish the evil of Donald Trump's proposal. Its evilness is actually not in the idea, but it's the cavalier nature in which he speaks about entire populations as if it were in the United States. You might recall, I don't quite know where your memory stretches back, but it was like for him, it's a massive urban renewal project where you simply take the populations and thrust them from one side of the chessboard to the other. So it's the cruelty with which he carries on, because they're little people. They are the unimportant, lesser peoples of the world for whom massive population transfers simply aren't morally significant. Still, I have to say, and you'll forgive me for repeating myself, the situation to which Donald Trump speaks, that was created, or you could say the pretext for his Gaza Riviera plan. The pretext was created by the Biden Blinken administration.
Yeah, I don't want to read too much into Trump's thinking or his mind. My belief is that clearly he looks at the Israelis as people he values more than the Palestinians. There's no doubt about that. Pretty much all of the West does that. My guess is that on some level he doesn't understand or doesn't assign value to the Palestinian connection to that land, the cultural and religious and historic attachment that Palestinians feel toward that land, and puts himself in that position and says, well, if the choice for me were sitting in rubble for the next 7 years or having some development or the border of Egypt or Jordan or whatever, it's clearly better for the people to go where they're not living in death and destruction and disease. But let me ask you, because I think the point that you're making is such a critical one. It's so frustrating sometimes how it gets how lost it's gotten. What we just witnessed in Gaza over 16 months was done not just with the green lighting of the Biden administration, but they paid for it, they armed it, they isolated the United States from the world to diplomatically shield it at the UN, at the ICC, elsewhere. Even as you say, the worst parts of what Trump has suggested, which is this population transfer, was in their own more subtle and diplomatically polite way what Blinken was attempting to do in persuading the Egyptians to take Palestinians as well. There was this calculation that was made by a lot of Palestinian and Arab voters in the middle of the country, a lot of leftist voters, that basically reasoned as follows. We don't think that Donald Trump is going to be anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian by any means, but given everything that we just watched the Democrats do, and at the end of the day, that is their destruction, that is their genocide. It happened on their watch and at their hands. It's almost impossible to see how Trump could be worse, and the kind of unpredictability of Trump, whatever his motives are, could create a possibility for things to be marginally better. Given that, as you say, the horrific bombing has subsided, and I think everybody attributes that to Trump, is there on some level some vindication, not for that belief, but for that hope that if we continue with Democrats, I'm very convinced that if Kamala won that election, that bombing would still be going on. There would be no ceasefire. Given what we just saw with the Democrats and what we know we're getting from them, why not roll the dice with Trump, who, whatever else you might want to say about him, is an unpredictable figure?
I do believe there is one inhibiting factor on Trump. And that inhibiting factor is the following. He doesn't want the albatross of Gaza on his watch because he saw what it did during the Biden administration. It became a real public and political burden for the Biden-Blinken administration. Now, I don't believe that Mr. Blinken has a shot of heart except maybe in his personal life. But people can have very different personas in their personal and public life. Mr. Hitler loved his dogs. Mr. Himmler was a vegetarian, but that didn't inhibit them in their political, their professional life. And I suppose Mr. Blinken might be a good father for all I know, but he didn't give, in his professional capacity, he didn't give a darn about the people of Gaza, probably about any lesser peoples. But it became, but you remember when, for example, Blinken was confronted, as he occasionally was during his news conferences, about the crimes in Gaza. The cameras honed in on him, and you could see the quivers in his face and the unease that it was causing him. I don't think that was an act. I think it became a real burden for them. And Donald Trump is determined that that's not going to occur again under his watch. And so even though he talks about hell to pay if his orders aren't obeyed by Hamas, I do not believe he is eager to unleash a new round of genocidal bombing in Gaza, because he doesn't want to repeat the mishaps of the Biden-Blinken years, or 16 months. So that will be an inhibiting factor on him. Otherwise, no, I think you have to bear in mind the range of options are very, very limited. What exactly can he or can't he do? So when you talk about the throw of the dice, and I think a lot of people vote for Trump both times on the throw of the dice consideration, but I don't think there's all that much they can do. I'm not even clear. I read the reports. I'm not a civil engineer. I don't claim to on-the-ground knowledge, but there have been a series of reports, the last of which said, the UN report, that there are 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza. The rubble is mixed in with unexploded ordnance and toxic substances. It will take, if 100 trucks are admitted a day, and I can't believe Israel will allow 100 trucks to be admitted a day, but if they do, even with 100 trucks working full-time, 24/7, it would take 15 years just to clear out the rubble, without any reconstruction, just clearing out the rubble. So I'm not really sure what are any plausible scenarios for the people to remain there. I'll have to wait, as I usually do, to hear what the experts have to say, what the UN agencies will propose as an alternative to the Gaza Riviera plan. I have to wait and see. But the options are really, at this point, judging from what's been written, the options really are very limited.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, we did shows on Trump's population transfer proposal and expressed all the revulsion and moral repugnance that it deserves. But on the other hand, I have to acknowledge that one of the most horrific things about watching everything that's happened to Gaza is not just the death and destruction, but this is a society that had a very serious value on education. It had serious universities, some of the best healthcare professionals in the world, the highest literacy rates of countries pretty much anywhere. And you're talking about a people who have built for themselves, albeit with extreme deprivations for everything that they've encountered, a kind of society in which some degree of human thriving has become possible and encouraged and valued. And it is very difficult to envision how anything like that could be remotely reconstructed in this place for all the reasons that you just said. And to think about 2 million people who have just endured the ones who survived some of the most psychologically traumatizing and horrific experiences imaginable, to then have that misery and suffering and deprivation prolonged for another decade or 2 decades, it does start to make you open to almost out of desperation to some way to alleviate that suffering. And there's ways you could think of to do it, but they're not really realistic. Let me just move a little bit to the West Bank. I think throughout 2024, my assumption had always been that the Trump administration was going to formally acknowledge the West Bank as part of Israel as the sovereign over the West Bank. That was, I think, clearly what Miriam Adelson wanted most in giving Trump more than $100 million for his campaign. Mike Huckabee, the now ambassador to Israel, explicitly advocates that. So does Elise Stefanik, the UN ambassador. What we're now seeing in the West Bank is obviously a very significant escalation of bombing and killing, and not ready to yet say that they're doing to the West Bank what they did to Gaza, but if it continued to escalate, you would start entering a territory of that kind. What do you think is the current Israeli intention and the American intention with respect to the West Bank?
Okay, I want to back up a minute. I'm going to get right to your question, but just back up. And I'll say something that's heretical, and people, of course, can disagree with me. In itself, there's nothing intrinsically or morally wrong with what Trump is proposing, although the language is very crude and heartless. It was recognized for a very long time that the resolution of the Palestinian refugee question, and 70% of the people in Gaza constitute refugees or descendants of refugees. It was recognized that there were going to be 3 possibilities for resolving what's called the Palestinian refugee question. One would be exercise of the right of return. And if you look at the negotiations closely, as I have, the consensus seemed to be that that particular option would be minimal. The numbers put forth by the Palestinian negotiators at the various diplomatic attempts to resolve the conflict, be it Camp David in 2000, be it the Annapolis negotiations in 2007. If you looked at the numbers that the Palestinians were throwing around, they put the numbers somewhere around 500,000 Palestinians would be repatriated to Israel over a 10-year period. The number of actual refugees and descendants, the figure is usually put at roughly, these are all rough numbers, so don't hold me to it. I'm not out of the ballpark, but I have the numbers. I know the numbers, so I'm giving you rough numbers. Because the ranges are wide. But we're talking about 6 million refugees who have the refugee status, of whom the Palestinians were throwing around numbers, sometimes 200,000, sometimes 800,000. But next to the bulk of the problem, we're not really talking about a significant number. The second possibility was that the Palestinians would be resettled in the place where they currently live. So most of the Palestinian refugees are living in Lebanon, some in Syria, Jordan, a large number. So they would be resettled there with some sort of financial compensation. And the third possibility was called resettlement in a third country. So countries like Canada were mentioned, countries like Australia were mentioned. Those were the three possibilities. So when Trump says the Palestinians will want to leave because of the, presumably he means the financial incentives, in addition, of course, to the crude force, or brute force, it's not totally an out-to-lunch statement to make. Now, how people choose between those three options, that's up to them. Though, as I said, the Palestinian negotiators seem to suggest there would be a cap on those returning to Israel itself. Some Palestinians suggested if you give a system of graduated incentives, if you return to Israel, you'll get X amount of money compensation. If you stay in the country where you're currently residing, you'll get Y amount of compensation, more than X or X plus. And then if you go to a third country, it'll be X plus plus, that you can have a voluntary resolution of the refugee question. And that strikes me as perfectly plausible. The problem, as I see it, is this, that Israel is, as B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, Israel is a Jewish supremacist state. And it wants a purely Jewish state. It doesn't want non-Jews. It doesn't even want Goyim. It doesn't, they think they're better, that they should rule the world, but only Jews, a Jewish supremacist state. And so let us say that Trump, the so-called Trump plan, though there's no plan, it's just the pronouncement. Let's say the Trump pronouncement metamorphoses into a plan. Then what's going to happen? You quote unquote solve the Gaza question. But then what does that want to mean? Then you're going to have the West Bank question. And what's the solution to the West Bank question? Well, from the point of view of Israel, there's only one solution: to leave, like the people in Gaza. And then you have the question of the Arabs in Israel. And how do you solve that question? And so, to my mind, the main problem with this notion of deportation of the Arabs in Gaza, the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, the main problem is it's going to open up a Pandora's box, because then they're going to look for the same solution in the West Bank. As the cliche has it, the hunger increases with each bite. They won't be satisfied with anything less than an Arab Rhine, R-E-I-N, as in Judenrein, an Arab Rhine West Bank, and then an Arab Rhine Israel. They will not accept anything less.
But just on that, you have this pressure. I'm not sure how much the Israelis or the Americans care. I don't think very much. But this idea that very shortly, or essentially now, you have an apartheid situation because between the river and the sea, the number of Arabs outnumber the number of Jews. If you were to transfer out the 2 million people in Gaza, at the very least, that alleviates the problem for the moment, because now you've taken 2 million Arabs out. And I don't know, maybe the Israelis, the Israeli Jews, believe they can tolerate a minority Arab population as long as they get to rule over them. The problem becomes when they become the majority, and then either they have democratic rights or you have an apartheid situation. So perhaps just depopulating Gaza of Arabs solves that problem for the moment.
I never quarrel with facts. I think there is an argument to be made there. But I also believe that there is this very pronounced tendency in Israeli society to make the whole place pure. You know, you have to remember, in Nazi Germany, Jews were only 1% of the German population. There were 60 million, my memory is, I think 60 million Germans, 60 or now I can't remember. But it was only 1%. But that was 1% too many for the Nazi ideology. And I think any percentage, short of a trivial number, any percentage for the Israelis is too much. It's one Arab too many, 10 Arabs too many. It's if you read, as I have done in the past few months, if you read the explosion of sheer racial derangement in Israeli society, the glee, the joy, the euphoria they have carried on with in the extermination of the people of Gaza, just the postings on their social media, it's a genuine sight to behold. And I am not sure whether it hasn't reached or plumbed a depth well beyond Nazi Germany, even in the years of war, the peak, when the Germans started to lose the war and they blamed the whole loss on the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. So you're constantly bombarded every day in Nazi Germany that our soldiers are dying, they're freezing on the Russian front, they're freezing to death on the Russian front, and all of this is because of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. And that was the only thing they heard. Remember, Germany was a totalitarian state. I suppose some people heard the BBC with what was called back then a short wave radio. Maybe some did, but probably only a handful. But I don't believe, judging from what I've seen, and the evidence is very thin because it was a totalitarian state, it was very difficult to measure what's called public opinion in those circumstances. But and you have to remember, as I'm sure you know, formally, at any rate, the Nazi genocide was kept out of public view. Now, of course, most people who wanted to know knew enough horrors were happening, because 50% of the Jews killed during World War II were not killed in the death camps. They were just lined up and shot down. So enough soldiers witnessed enough, and they heard the stories, so they knew enough to know something horrible was happening. How much they knew about the gas chambers, I don't think there's any. I stopped studying it 20 years ago, and there's probably been a vast proliferation of scholarship in the subject, but I knew the literature quite well as of 20 years ago. There wasn't much knowledge in how much the Germans knew. But this is a totally different thing in Israel. This is every night on the evening talk shows. The social media is saturated with soldiers boasting in glee about the crimes they're committing in Gaza. So this country is so completely unhinged that I'm not certain they'll tolerate any Arab presence, or if they tolerate it, it will be the same way as we tolerate in our country a Black presence in the American South, namely the conditions being unlivable. And here I would want to make a distinction. You call it an apartheid regime, and it's been called by many people an apartheid regime. But there is a slight, not slight, a not trivial difference. The South Africans wanted the black population. That was their working population. They wanted to confine them technically to Bantustans. But most of the blacks, they may have a passport that says you belong to Transkei, Ciskei, Bofu, Botswana, and all the other Bantustans, but they didn't live in the Bantustans. They lived in encampments because they were working in South Africa, and they were wanted. They were wanted. Israel doesn't want them to work there. It wants them gone. So even if you reduced the Gaza population, I still think there will be, and so the demographic problem is solved to some extent. I still think you're going to have this kind of juggernaut, this ideological juggernaut, to drive all the subhumans, the Untermenschen, the subhumans, out of all of Israel. And then you're going to have the pressures on the land. They want the land. So even if the demographic problem is solved, the land problem remains. They want the land. Dunam by dunam, they want to take over all the land, not especially, but at a greater even degree in places like East Jerusalem, which still puts you on a collision course. So I consider the so-called Trump plan, the real horror of the plan is it will legitimize the complete ethnic cleansing of that area. And if Israel gets its way, it'll be ethnic cleansing of parts of Syria, ethnic cleansing of parts of Lebanon. These people are, they're completely mad. It's an unhinged society. It's a freakish society, in my opinion. When you actually read these statements coming out of that place.
Yeah, I think one of the moments that opened a lot of people's eyes was when those Israeli soldiers were caught on video gang raping helpless Palestinian detainees, many of whom had never even been charged with a crime. And you had a discourse that immediately emerged that rape of Palestinians, gang rape of Palestinians, is justifiable. You had marches in defense of those soldiers outside of where they had been detained, including by members of the Knesset, demanding they had been released on the ground they did nothing wrong. You go and have any kind of person on the street interview in Israel and you ask about the number of children who have been killed in Gaza, and they'll simply say, who cares? It's almost like a universal answer. It's a culture and a society that has become, obviously not universally, but overwhelmingly, completely inured and in denial of the humanity of everybody other than of Jews. Norman, let me... Go ahead.
Another aspect which has to be borne in mind, if you take the United States during the war in Vietnam, and atrocities of a very high magnitude were occurring there. In the end, about 2 million Vietnamese were killed by the U.S., about 1 million Laotians, and about 750,000 Cambodians were killed by the U.S. So there were atrocities occurring at a very high level. However, for people like myself, you're going to college, you had a very, very remote connection with the actual killers. So the most famous case, it was actually trivial by the standards of what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam, but the most famous case was, of course, Lieutenant Calley and the My Lai massacre. Now, when we, speaking for myself, when we saw Lieutenant Calley, he was a person that was completely alien to our ambiance, our mindset. He was this Southern redneck. In our minds, he's a cracker, an idiot, uneducated. And so we were able to distance ourselves, at least morally. We were able to distance ourselves from the actual killers. If you were in college, you got I guess it was the 4F deferment, it was called, for your duration of your college education. That's not true of Israeli society. Israel has a citizen army. Now, in principle, a citizen army is the correct thing. Every individual should have to bear the burden up to and including death to defend the sovereignty and independence of his or her country. So a citizen army is the right thing. It shouldn't be a certain portion, always poor, the portion that does the work that requires sacrifice, mortal sacrifice. It should be everybody. However, there is a flip side. If your country, if your state is engaged in a genocidal assault, then as a citizen army, that army is representative of everybody. It's not Lieutenant Cali or the Lieutenant Callies. It's everyone. So when you see those, what you call horrific videos, those horrific marches, they're really representative of the cross section of Israeli society. I was reading, it was Lee Mordechai, he's the Princeton trained historian, and he mentioned that even that venerable bastion of liberalism, Haaretz newspaper, for the first 5 months, it refused to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, even though it was perfectly obvious, as he says, the humanitarian costs of what Israel is doing. Even Haaretz went along with the genocide. So it's in my opinion, it's a much more sinister insight into what happened and has happened in Gaza, that it's embraced because it's a citizen army, it's embraced by the cross-section of Israeli society. And then there's the other side. If you ever talk to Israelis, and I've had occasion to speak to many of them, the seminal experience in every Israeli's life is service in the army. And service in the army becomes a kind of family relationship. So you have the normal sense of solidarity from being citizens of the same state. And that normal sense of solidarity is then doubled by the sense of solidarity of this being a Jewish state, our Jewish state. And then you have that sense of solidarity is then compounded by the solidarity that every soldier, because everybody served in the army, or everybody's brother, sister, mother, father, sibling, they're all now serving in the army. So there's a third kind of familial relationship, the citizen relationship, the Jewish people relationship, and now that army relationship of family. So they all are very defensive about criticizing the IDF, because criticizing the IDF is not like our generation criticizing the Marines or criticizing the armed forces, or even, by the way, even the CIA. The Mossad is our family. The Shin Bet is our family. They all serve, have served, and family members are serving. And so that sense of social solidarity, in particular, when it comes to the army and the conduct and the behavior of the army, it's so robust. That's why Israelis, without a blink of an eye or a miss of their heartbeat, will say, we have the most moral army in the world, because they're talking about themselves. No American I know of would make the claim that the U.S. Army is the most moral army in the world. That I've not heard. I've heard many things in my day, but I've not heard that. But every Israeli will say that. You know why? Because they're talking about themselves. Me, I'm the most moral person in the world. So you have these multiple levels of solidarity climaxing in that army experience. You know, when once you're in the paratroopers, and I had friends who were in the paratroopers, 20, 30 years later, they still speak with reverence of their fellow paratroopers. It's the seminal experience for an Israeli, and it leads, as you can imagine, when your country is carrying on in a genocidal manner. Not that before it was particularly beautiful what they did, but when you're carrying on in a genocidal manner and you are so defensive of the armed forces, it leads to very ugly consequences.
Let me ask you just a couple more questions about the role of the Arab states in the region as a potential constraint on some of what might take place. In particular, it seems very clear to me that Trump's constructive, positive relationship with these Gulf state dictators is a very high priority for him. He loves the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Jordanians and the Kuwaitis for obvious reasons. They do a lot of business with them. That's the kind of people that he really likes. His new son-in-law, in fact, is from this very wealthy Lebanese family. He speaks very highly of these kind of Arabs. These are the kind of Arabs who he really, really loves. The Abraham Accords in that first term were part of the most important legacy in his view, and they want to normalize relations with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis and the Jordanians and create this one giant alliance that will be a check against the Iranians, or maybe even normalize relationship with the Iranians. This is Trump's vision. The argument is that, and this is maybe the optimistic argument, is that none of that is possible, this extremely high priority that Trump has, as long as the Palestinians are being mistreated. You're talking about population transfers or even just leaving them in rubble, that unless the Palestinians are given some degree of dignity and better treatment, that those governments would either be unwilling or just unable because of their own problems with their restive population if they were seen normalizing relations with Israel under these conditions. How much of a constraint do you really think that is? How limited are these Arab governments by the reaction of their own populations when it comes to being pressured not to do a deal as long as the Israelis are treating the Palestinians this way?
Well, it's an interesting historical question, because there was a period in the 1970s and 80s when the Palestinian question had tremendous symbolic force. It wasn't, Palestinians weren't a military power to speak of. They're obviously not an economic power to speak of, but they had a huge amount of symbolic power. And that became clear during the Camp David Accords that were orchestrated by President Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was an extraordinarily smart guy. He had a huge amount of mental energy. He was detail-oriented to the point of it being bedazzling, mesmerizing. I've read through a large part of his papers, and I have to tell you, I was totally overwhelmed by his grasp of detail. And when he came into office in 1976, he said as one of his principal objectives to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Oh, excuse me, that was a major error by me. To resolve the Israel-Arab conflict, because he comes in right after the 1973 war, and that war hadn't been resolved because Israel was occupying the Egyptian Sinai, as it had been since 1967. It was occupying the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal. And so it was causing a lot of turbulence in the poor portion of the world where the U.S. claimed a vital interest. And then he embarked on this journey to resolve the Israel-Arab conflict, of which one component was the Palestinians. He reaches the conclusion at a certain point, I can't resolve the whole thing. It's not going to happen under my watch because the Israelis won't accept it. What the Israelis were open to was resolving the Israel-Egyptian aspect of the Israel-Arab conflict. It's completely forgotten now, but Egypt was it was the formidable military and political force in the Arab world. And the attitude of the Israelis was summarized by he was the defense minister and then the foreign minister, Moshe Dayan. He said famously, if you remove a wheel from the car, if you remove one wheel from a car, it can't move. And the Israelis wanted to remove the Egyptian wheel from the Arab car or the Arab front so that the Arabs would have no military option against Israel. And so the Israelis were willing to give up the Sinai, which they had occupied, the whole of the Sinai. However, Mr. Sadat, who was the president of Egypt at the time, he had a problem. And that was the symbolic force of the Palestinian question. And Carter did everything he could to try to get the Arab states, in particular the Saudis, to go along with this Egypt-Israel deal. And the Saudis kept saying, we can't do it unless you give something to the Palestinians, because otherwise we will suffer the consequences of selling out the Palestinians. So you have to give them something. And Carter was unable to wring or wrest any significant concessions out of the Israelis. Sadat was very nervous, because he knew if he couldn't get the Saudi backing, he would have a lot of trouble. And the Saudis said he would be completely ostracized in the Arab world. And the Saudis said, we can't do anything unless you give something to the Palestinians, because that symbolic value of the Palestinian cause was so compelling. Well, we all know what happened. They signed the agreement. They got nothing for the Palestinians except for this silly local autonomy agreement, which meant nothing, and Prime Minister Begin rapidly discarded it. And Sadat got a bullet in his head. And for the Egyptian, excuse me, for the Arab world, the people like the Saudis, they remember that. Now, the power of the Palestinian cause has been, in the Arab world, has been significantly diminished. The main reason, in my opinion, being after the humanitarian catastrophes in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, after those colossal humanitarian catastrophes, the Palestine cause, its resonance significantly diminished, both because those humanitarian catastrophes were also of a very high degree, and secondly, because societies start to turn inwards to focus on their own humanitarian disasters and not just the Palestinian one. So it did lose a lot of its resonance, which ultimately enabled some of the states to the so-called sign on to the so-called Abraham Accords. But I don't think a complete selling out of the Palestinians is possible for two reasons. One, if large numbers of them end up in Egypt or Jordan, it's going to significantly undermine already wobbly regimes. And also because there is a fear of that bullet to the head that Sadat, and before him Sadat, it was King Abdullah in 1951, who also got a bullet to his head for selling out the Palestinians. So those will be considerations, I think, for the Saudis. The places like the Emirates, they're not really states. As you can imagine, I don't agree with Professor Dershowitz on virtually anything, but once he made a point, whether it originated with him, I can't say. He once said of the Gulf states, he said, quote, "Those aren't states, those are family-owned gas stations." And I think that's accurate. They have no real geopolitical significance. Yes, they have lots of money. I was reading yesterday, I don't know if it's true, it's not yet been verified, but it said that the Emirates offered South Africa $25 million in investment if they would drop the case against Israel in the ICJ. So they have money to throw around, but they're not states. They're family-owned gas stations.
Yeah, something like 70% of their population or 80% are foreign workers who are there simply to work for those families. All right, last question. We had a lot of questions from our members when they knew we were going to talk to you, and I'm going to just pick one here given time, which is from Sijma. And he asked the following question for Norman Finkelstein. It seems to me that the Western press has paid little attention to American political pressure in Lebanon. While many of my non-Shiite friends in Lebanon have been strongly supportive of Hezbollah, it's clear that the U.S. has exerted largely subtle pressure to undermine Hezbollah, including economic sanctions and in some cases trying to influence sectors of the population through U.S. aid grants. But these efforts do not seem to have swayed the majority of the population against Hezbollah-style resistance, only the very rich and those closely connected to the U.S. and French power centers. Israel has repeatedly broken the terms of the November ceasefire by systematically continuing to demolish houses and infrastructure in South Lebanon and firing on civilians. Israel wants to keep a military presence in Lebanon and to delay other ceasefire terms. But this week, the U.S. made clear that they continue to insist on the withdrawal of all Israeli troops by February 18th. There seem to be some mixed messages here. What do you think is going on in terms of the Israeli occupation in Lebanon and the U.S. demand that it withdraw?
I don't have any specific insights on that. I would just say as some general observations on the subject. Number one, I don't think there can be any doubt that Hezbollah was significantly weakened in the course of the Israeli counteroffensive against them, which came much later than the Gaza situation. I think personally, though the question wasn't directed at me personally, I had overestimated Hezbollah's military capacities. In retrospect, I can see that I was simply, that I was not thinking clearly. When you have the Israeli, British, French, Saudi, Jordanian, Egyptian, American, the whole of the Pentagon, when you have this combined force determined to undermine, if not destroy, Hezbollah, that a non-state actor like Hezbollah, even as it was getting significant aid from Iran, and even as it was, its constituents were deeply committed to the cause. I think it's sometimes forgotten that the other side is also deeply committed to their cause. I remember I had a friend who was the chief technology, a childhood friend, who was the chief technology officer for Unisys, the Washington-based defense computers outfit. And we were once talking, and he said to me, well, you know, Norm, whatever I should have said, he was in charge of the computer system in the Bush-Cheney White House. And he said to me once, you know, Norman, they work very hard. And in fact, it's true. The Hezbollah people were deeply committed to the cause as they understood it. But guess what? So was Rumsfeld and Cheney. Rumsfeld put in very solid days, 16-hour days. You know, probably he never sat down. He stood at a lectern, always sending out memos. They called them snowflakes. So there was that deep commitment on both sides. And as talented as the technicians were on the Hezbollah side, and they were very talented, they combined the intelligence with the fervor of the cause. Well, my friend Mark Cohn, I shouldn't say that, he's passed, so it's okay, who was in charge of the computer system in the White House, guess what? He was also very talented. And then if you multiply his talent, which I think is unmatchable, he once said to me, he said, Norman, I'm not conceited, which is true. He was completely devoid of ego and conceit. He just said, I'm confident that if a problem is presented to me, I can figure it out. And that was true. You put a problem to him, a mathematical problem, a scientific problem, you can figure it out. But the difference is the resources, the numbers. Hezbollah is a non-state actor. And then you have the Pentagon, the British intelligence, the French intelligence, the Saudis. They're all working to destroy Hezbollah. And it was a very uneven match. And at the end, Hezbollah could not withstand it. And the Israelis were never able to invade Lebanon. They stayed at the border, because if it was on the battlefield, I believe they would have been slaughtered because the army of God, the Hezbollah, knew the turf and so forth. But there was a serious mismatch of sheer material resources. And I think Nasrallah, under the Secretary General of the Hezbollah, Sayed Nasrallah, I think he understood that, and he was put in an impossible position. And at the end, in my opinion, I can't prove it, but I think he effectively committed suicide by going into that war room, which was obviously a suicidal act. The area where he was being bombed all week. It was filled with spies. He had to know what was coming. So, and the fact of the matter is, he was by a wide margin. You know, you don't have to believe in the great man theory of history. You don't have to believe in that theory to believe that individuals at certain moments can make a big difference. And Syed Nasrallah, his person, his intelligence, his commitment, his dignity, they made a big difference. And now there's a huge loss. There's a vacuum where he once was. And I don't think that vacuum is easily replaced. As I said, you know, I believe on a completely separate matter, I think Professor Chomsky's absence has had a very negative effect, because for my generation, when any situation arose, be it Vietnam, be it Nicaragua, be it East Timor, be it 1,000 places spanning the globe, we all look to Professor Chomsky because he had impeccable moral judgment and he had a lifetime's political experience. We looked to him, and you could say, at the risk of it sounding hyperbolic, exaggerate, I think it can fairly be said that he united a large portion of the left. His judgment in any particular situation, because so many people turned to it and deferred to it because of his moral judgment and mastery of the facts, they accepted it. And so it created a unity among the left. And in his absence, you can't really think or imagine a unifying figure, let alone a unifying organization. So that's a long-winded, digressive way of saying you don't have to believe in the great man theory of history to acknowledge at a particular historic moment, a single individual can play a very large role. Even Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionist, even though he was a firm Marxist, and Marxists always rejected the great man theory of history, he was very emphatic. He said, if there had not been Lenin in 1917, there wouldn't have been a Russian Revolution. There couldn't have been. He played a critical role. And I think the same thing is true of Nasrallah, and his absence has left a vacuum in the Hezbollah. I think it's going to be very difficult. I don't want to, there are many Syrians who feel a great deal of animus towards Nasrallah and the Party of God because they support the Bashar regime. And I have to respect those feelings. But I do think his absence, his loss is a tremendous one.
All right, Norman, enlightening as always. I wish we had things that were a little bit more uplifting to discuss. Maybe sometime soon we will. At the very least, the bombardment has stopped for the moment, and there's something, I guess, to celebrate in that. Always really appreciate your time. It's always very educational, I think, for everyone to hear you, and we appreciate your coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, have a good afternoon.